You may not think you know any Yiddish, but if you've ever kvetched, schlepped, or noshed on a bagel with schmear, let me be the first to say,
Mazel tov.
you speak a little Yiddish. And even if you don't know a single Yiddish word, you probably recognize the rhythm and attitude of the language.
Why can't we sit over there?
That's not a booth!
So who says we have to sit in a booth?
I didn't take the subway all the way to New York to sit at a table like that!
That comic delivery comes straight from Yiddish theater. Meanwhile, the inflections of the language, not to mention its colorful vocabulary, crept into American English, lodging itself permanently in the dialect of native New Yorkers. Quite a comeback for a language that lost 90% of its speakers during the 20th century. In fact, Yiddish has overcome a lot of obstacles over its long, rich history, including some that may surprise you. So how did this funky mashup of German, Hebrew, and Aramaic manage to survive? For a Jewish language, Yiddish is surprisingly young, a sprightly 1,000-year-old product of the diaspora. The OG Jewish language is Hebrew. During the Iron Age, our Israelite ancestors used Hebrew for everything from commerce to everyday conversation to religious ritual. But as the Holy Land changed hands again and again, new languages entered the Jewish lexicon. By the year 200 BCE, most Jews were using Aramaic or Greek in their everyday lives, reserving Hebrew for holy pursuits like Torah study, prayer, ritual, and poetry. As the Jewish diaspora widened, moving from the Middle East towards Europe, Africa, and the Americas, so did the range of Jewish languages. But even as Jews adopted local languages, Hebrew and Aramaic lingered just under the surface, creating unique Jewish languages and dialects. In Arab countries, Jews spoke Judeo-Arabic, a mashup of the local Arabic dialect, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Spanish Jews used Ladino, a blend of Castilian Old Spanish, Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Turkish, and Greek. And sometime in the 9th century, Ashkenazi Jews in Europe developed Yiddish, a mix of medieval German, Hebrew, Aramaic, and later, Slavic languages. In fact, the name Yiddish literally means Jewish. Every language has a character. English is sprawling and immense, borrowing freely from a buffet of other languages. French is considered elegant and refined. And Yiddish is often called earthy, which is a polite way of saying that it's politically incorrect, deeply interested in the human body, and full of absolutely savage expressions. Want to cuss someone out without using any four-letter words? Try learning Yiddish, so you can tell your enemies that you hope they grow like an onion with their heads in the ground. Or that you wish them not one, but 3 mothers-in-law. Or that you think they'd look better as a chandelier, hanging all day, burning all night. There's a lot more where that came from, because Yiddish speakers take their cursing seriously. According to Professor Michael Wex, that's no coincidence. His 2005 bestseller, Born to Kvetch, theorizes that Yiddish is essentially the language of complaining, or as we say in Yiddish, kvetchen. Which makes a lot of sense when you remember that Yiddish, like all other Jewish languages other than Hebrew and Jewish Aramaic, was born in exile. And though some exiles are more comfortable than others, Europe in the Middle Ages was not one of them, what with all the crusading and pogroming and punishing Jews for the Black Plague. Wex writes that kvetching became a way of exercising some small measure of control over an otherwise hostile environment.
What are you talking about?
I can't sleep in there.
Of course you can.
I can't. I can't.
That stereotypical Jewish grandparent-style complaint, that's classic Yiddish, from the cadences to the kvetching. But Yiddish is so much more than punchlines and grumbling.
Yiddish is a 1,000-year-old Jewish fusion language, the language of Ashkenazi Jewry, and it is the repository of 1,000 years worth of Jewish hopes and anxieties and creativity and aspirations, really everything that makes up a civilization.
Today, many non-native Yiddish speakers treat Yiddish like a punchline. But for the people who speak it daily, Yiddish isn't a joke. It was and is the language of everyday life. It is rich, it is deep, and it produced and created Ashkenazi Jewish culture. Today, many Jews and non-Jews who live in Jewish areas might think of Yiddish as a kind of spice to sprinkle lightly into conversation when no other language will do. Sometimes you just need to let out an YIVO, you know what I'm saying?
YIVO.
There's just no substitute for words like nebish, shlemiel, or shlemazel, which are both evocative and untranslatable.
A shlemiel is the guy who spills soup at a fancy party. A schlemazel is the guy he spills it on.
So if Yiddish was the soundtrack of a millennium of Ashkenazi life, Why don't more Jewish people speak it today? Well, there's a long answer and a short answer. The short answer is Nazis. Between 1939 and 1945, the majority of native Yiddish speakers were exterminated. Entire towns simply disappeared, and the theaters, newspapers, books, advertisements, and conversation went with them. By 1945, very few Yiddish speakers were left to read the newspapers and see the plays that had once captivated 11 million people around the world. The Soviets, meanwhile, picked up where the Nazis left off.
In the Soviet Union, which seemed like it was initially going to be a very friendly home for Yiddish, under Stalin, Yiddish was brutally suppressed, and many speakers of Yiddish were murdered or exiled into conditions that often were a death sentence.
But the decline of Yiddish doesn't rest solely on Hitler or Stalin. Well before either of them came to power, the Jewish world was engaged in furious debate. What else is new? This time, they were debating the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment. By the 18th century, the European Enlightenment had made its way to the shtetl, inspiring Jewish scholars to re-examine everything, from their religious traditions to their own language. As a result, many began to view their native tongue with disdain.
The most influential Yiddish writers were not the great writers of the classics, but rather these pulp fiction writers who would go around and have their little pamphlets of eye-catching stories. So it was understood to be the language of the people. So Hebrew at that time was considered the elite literary language, which was sort of the descendant of the elite rabbinical language. And Yiddish was like the jargon. Hebrew was a representation of a rejection of that society that Yiddish flourished in.
So Enlightenment scholars began writing in Hebrew, adapting the biblical grammar and vocabulary. Imagine if your friend decided that they want to start writing all their papers in Latin. That's how intense and committed these guys were. Meanwhile, one scholar was combining the study of Hebrew with modern nationalism. Eliezer Yitzchak Perlman was a Zionist, though that title didn't exist at the time. He believed in the project of building a Jewish national home in the Ottoman territory of Palestine. And he believed that when you're in the ancestral home, you speak the ancestral language. So when Perelman showed up in Ottoman Palestine in 1881, he immediately made himself a pain in the tuchus by refusing to speak to his fellow Jews in any language other than Hebrew. He changed his name to Eliezer ben Yehuda, or Eliezer the son of Judah, to symbolize his connection with ancient Judea. And he breathed new life into the language of ancient Judea, updating the biblical vocabulary to include modern concepts like electricity or ice cream. For many early Zionists, Hebrew and Yiddish simply could not coexist. Yiddish was the language of diaspora, of exile, of the past. It was the language of the pogrom, of helplessness, of kvetching and despair. Hebrew was ancient, the language of Jewish warriors and kings. Soon, it became the language of the Jewish future. But Yiddish wasn't going down without a fight. Two groups refused to give up the language they had spoken for 1,000 years.
In Israel, the Haredim who speak Yiddish, it's like a form of keeping the old Yishuv identity in Israel and keeping this stronger 20th century European forged identity in America and other places.
Many Ashkenazi Haredi Jews prefer Yiddish because to them, Hebrew is so holy they don't want to debase it with everyday conversation about the electricity bill or the latest election. Then there's the little matter of tradition. Haredim cling very tightly to the traditions and identity that were almost entirely wiped out during the Holocaust. Speaking Yiddish is an important part of maintaining that identity, even in the Jewish state. But Yiddish was not the only casualty in the Great Language War. When the Jewish people returned to Israel from 2,000 years in exile, they brought the languages that had sustained them in the diaspora. Every variant of Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, Hakatiya, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Malayalam, and on and on and on. But as new immigrants assimilated into the Jewish state, they mostly left these old languages behind. Modern Hebrew became the great unifier. And today, most Israeli Jews don't speak more than a few words of their grandparents' diaspora languages.
Obviously, when we talk about the policies of mandatory Palestine and then the very young state of Israel, we're talking about a different moment when clearly there was a sense that these languages were in competition, and in order for Hebrew to take root as the language of this new nation state, everything else had to give way, whether it was Judeo-Arabic, Ladino, or Yiddish. Everyone had to kind of set aside their global Jewish identities in service of creating and sustaining Israeli identity.
Loss of native languages is a documented phenomenon among immigrant communities. The first generation usually understands and speaks their native language to some degree, but they generally don't pass it on to their kids. But some modern diaspora Jews are beginning to rekindle an interest in Yiddish, and that means Yiddish is often highly politicized. Many of today's Yiddishists draw on a long tradition of Jewish leftist organizing. They associate themselves with the Jewish Labor Bund, a secular, socialist, anti-Zionist Jewish political party that championed the concept of Doakite, or here-ness. In other words, they're diasporists. They want to be a part of Jewish culture and history, but they believe that Jews have a responsibility to invest in their diaspora communities rather than invest in Israel. They believed that Zionism was a distraction from the real fight, which was the pursuit of equality in the diaspora. They saw Zionism as a sort of escapism, a way to flee rather than confront diaspora anti-Semitism. The Bundist movement was yet another victim of the gas chambers, but its echoes linger among some modern progressive Jews who champion the here-ness of their ideological ancestors, adopting Yiddish as an expression of their Jewish identity. Of course, not all Yiddishists are anti-Zionist. Many simply want to connect to a core facet of their identities, one that was almost erased. And their population includes me. I'm a proud Israeli Hebrew speaker, but I'm also deeply interested in the Jewish story. Yiddish is an integral part of that story.
But the commonalities are this longing for the building of one's own Jewish identity, or the affirmation of one's own Jewish identity.
I think that there's a moment now where certainly North American Jews, but not only North American Jews, are understanding that something in us that is broken can be made more whole and can be healed through a meaningful encounter with Yiddish. Cultivating an awareness of global Jewish identities, their richness, their diversity, will only enrich American Jewish spaces.
And not just American spaces. Knowledge of Yiddish enriches Israeli spaces too, especially as debates rage about the role of Haredi Jews in Israeli society. A few years ago, I overheard a group of Haredi guys around my age passionately arguing with each other in Yiddish. These were my fellow Israelis, fellow Jews, yet I couldn't understand a word they were saying. So I decided to learn Yiddish. And the more I learned, the more I realized that Yiddish isn't merely a record of exile and diaspora. It's also a living testimony to our ancient origins. For 1,000 years, Jews in Europe laughed and cried and argued in a language inflected with biblical idioms and Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary. Yiddish and other diaspora languages are a testament to the power of Jewish resilience and ancestral memory. Yiddish has survived everything, from pogroms to mass slaughter, to the rise of modern Hebrew to assimilation. It adapted itself to English, shaping the rhythms of modern comedy and enriching the American vocabulary, particularly among New Yorkers. And though it will take many generations for Yiddish to re-enter the Jewish mainstream, young people across the world are showing an interest in rekindling the language and culture of their grandparents. And then there are Hasidic Jews, for whom Yiddish is a mother tongue, which means that for a growing subset of the Jewish population, Yiddish is also the language of the Jewish present and future.
Yiddish has been anxious about its own fortunes. So we often hear about the death of Yiddish, the revival of Yiddish. For the entire time that Yiddish has been aware of itself as a language, Yiddish has been attending its own funeral. And I would even say maybe sitting in the back row and snickering a little bit.
The majority of Ashkenazi Jews didn't stop speaking Yiddish because Yiddish was weak. They stopped speaking Yiddish because history was brutal. But it survived because culture is stubborn. No matter where we live, no matter our politics, all Jews have been shaped by the diaspora. And there is no Jewish diaspora language as famous or influential as Yiddish. It doesn't need to be a competition between Yiddish and Hebrew. People are complicated. Jewish identity is complicated. And as long as we stay curious and engaged, we are all part of the Jewish future, no matter what language we speak.